In 1905, Russia became famous. It became famous for revolution. A country that was seen as the prisoner of peoples, a police state, that European statesmen ridiculed for its oppressive nature, burst asunder in revolutionary anger. Today I want to outline why. What were the causes of this 1905 revolution? Second, I want to look at the revolution itself. Of what did the revolution consist? What were the main elements of 1905? And finally, we'll think about consequences. What were the implications of revolution of 1905? What did it actually achieve? What did it mean for the future in Russia? First of all then, causes. Economic turbulence is often the background for political discontent. And this was certainly the case in the run-up to 1905. Now, this was something that was true of the Russian economy, but interestingly also the world economy. The 1890s had been a period of particular boom on the world economic markets. Russian agriculture, Russian industry was doing particularly well. Russia enjoyed the highest rate of growths of any Western power at this time. So the expectation of the population was building up for more and more improvement, that life would become better, life would become gayer, life would become ever more joyous. This changed quite dramatically after 1900. There was a slump. And it was a slump that affected the Russian economy particularly badly. And here we see very modern phenomena. For example, a foreign oil concession in Baku closed down its factory and relocated to North Africa. 1/3 of that industry's jobs in that particular location lost overnight. So there was incredible social disquiet, incredible social discontent at this change in economic fortune. This was then radicalized because of a particular foreign adventure of the Tsarist regime, when in 1904 war broke out with Japan. Now, not an awful lot was known about Japan in the Russia of the early 20th century. Russian universities did not have professors of Japanese studies. There were no courses on Japanese society at Russian universities. There was, however, in the popular imagination, a view of Japan as somehow more backward than Russia. That the people of Japan were somehow inferior to Russia. That Russia, if anything, could teach Japan a lesson. What the course of the war revealed, however, was precisely the opposite. That Russia was losing to Japan. And it was losing to Japan in a war that was not a simple, cheap, localized war. It was losing in a war that was turning out to be incredibly expensive. That the Russo-Japanese War is interesting for historians of military history because it is one of the first examples of what modern historians call total war. That the resource demands of this war were so great that they severely impacted upon the effectiveness of the system in a whole range of ways. The amount of people who were pulled out of the economy and put into the army. The way the trade routes were disturbed because priority had to be given to the movement of troops rather than to the movement of trade. And through the boom of the 1890s, in which Russia's economic position was dependent upon the value of the ruble, in which Sergei Witte had worked incredibly hard to build balanced budgets, to make a guarantee of the value of the ruble by gold, The state finances were absolutely ruined by the Russo-Japanese War. So the course of the war, added to previous economic discontent and dislocation, made it incredibly harder, and this then fed into political radicalization. It was a political radicalization that importantly affected elite members of the society within the regime. Think of the Russian state at this time. Tsarism was an autocracy, but there were also other parts of the regime. Local government, particularly in the countryside, the zemstvas. These were institutions that were headed by the liberal elite of Russian society, educated professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors, and so on and so forth. Across 1904, these professional elites organised a political movement. It was a movement expressed in banquet campaigns, in which at what we would recognise as fundraisers, leading members of this liberal elite made political speeches for democratisation of the regime. That if this regime was to become more effective, it had to allow society a voice in the governance of Russia. So, economic dislocation, social dislocation, and then political discontent. Here was a society that was already bubbling. It had ferment. There were reasons for the regime to be worried. And then we have the spark. A big event, a key event that leads the whole country to become arisen in anger. Why should it be angry against this regime? Because of the events of 9th of January 1905, Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday is a remarkable event in many ways. How did a priest come to head a popular movement to try and take a petition to the Tsar's palace in the capital? Where did those demands come from? What sort of movement was behind this? And then there's the petition itself. There's a complete mismatch between the language of the petition, in which these people are asking their ever so kind ruler to make concessions. So the petition recognises the authority of the Tsar. It recognises the heartfelt feelings of the Tsar for his own people. Therefore, how could the Tsar possibly turn down these demands? But then the demands themselves were so radical that no Tsar could ever implement them. Giving all the land to the people. A Tsar couldn't do that because it would affect the very nature of private property. Couldn't happen. Giving fundamental rights to the workers within the factories. But that would take away from the right of the factory owners to manage their factories as they saw fit. Another attack on private property. The Tsar is not a socialist, the Tsar is a Tsar. Couldn't do that. And then, interestingly, the demand for the separation between church and state. But why was the Tsar Tsar? Because his authority came from God. It was the Russian Orthodox Church who anointed Tsar Nicholas II. It was no political institution. So if the Tsar was to separate church and state, the Tsar would take away the very basis for the Tsar's power. So the petition to the Tsar in January 1905 was about as radical a document as one could imagine in terms of the demands it placed upon the Tsar. And these were demands that were impossible for the Tsar to satisfy. In no way could the Tsar do this. And yet, in the analysis of the event, the petition itself has almost become forgotten. Because what is most important about the event is the fact that peaceful demonstrators who were carrying this petition loyally to their ruler were shot upon by the forces in the capital. Women and children died. And this is something for which the Tsar could not be forgiven. This was something that spread anger throughout Russian society and internationally as well. This was a ruler who now had blood on his hands. And in the immediate aftermath of this event, an event that has become so famous to us all through the way it's depicted in art, in cinema, in plays, in the aftermath of this event, the Tsar did not make any speech of contrition. An investigation was held by the regime, and this investigation found that at fault for the shootings was not the soldiers who shot upon the crowd, but the crowd itself. The crowd, it had argued, had put the safety of the capital in danger. The armed forces' first responsibility was to maintain order in the capital. Therefore, the demonstrators brought their deaths upon themselves. Now, this was, of course, not going to calm down the situation. It was going to lead to further protest. We are now in a situation of revolution. So the causes of 1905 was this combination of slightly longer term events running over 1901, 1902, 1903, 1904, and it's building and building and building this pressure, and then, boom, Bloody Sunday. And that's the spark that sets the country alight. So we now have revolution. But what type of revolution? What forms of revolution? Here I think we can distinguish at least 4 different types of popular protest. First of all, in the urban environment, in the major towns and cities. Here it's undoubtedly the working class that is taking the lead in the revolution. That the Russian workers become famous in 1905 for 2 things. First of all, the mass political strike. Now, it may seem obvious later on in the century that for workers to get concessions, they go on strike. The extent of strikes in 1905 in Russia and the purposes for which strikes were used, their political intent as well as their economic intent, this was something radically new in the Europe of the time. And it was so radically new that labour movements across Europe debated it. The German labour movement, the British labour movement, the French labour movement. Suddenly all eyes were on the Russian working class. How were strikes organised? For how long did they last? And with what success? These became the burning questions of the labour movement.